Having finished the discussion of the first phase of consumer theory, which is preference and indifference curves, now let's step into the phase two, which is to figure out the reality part. So the first part, so the preference part is basically out of the purpose of figuring out what the consumers like. And now in this part, we are going to look into a more realistic perspective, which is how thick the consumers' wallets are, right? So probably when we were doing indifference curve or preference, you had this question in mind. What if I like it, but I cannot afford it? And in this sector, we specifically look into this problem. So here is the constraint, which is called the budget constraint. The other constraints that consumers face as a result of limited incomes. Okay. And the budget constraint is also known as the budget line. And here we notice that all combinations of goods for which the total amount of money spent should just equal to your income, namely your budget. Okay, so there are actually two things to note here. The first one is this is a line, and what is the reason? And the second one is we deplete all our income when we are trying to purchase. So let me start with the simpler one, which is the second one. Okay, which also explains why we're putting an equal sign here. Okay, so if as consumers, if we are really like rational consumers and our purpose is trying to make the best of our budget to generate as high satisfaction as possible, then because more is better than less, right? We want to buy as many products as our budget allows. Therefore, we should not leave any money on the table. Namely, we need to deplete completely our income or budget. And then let's look at these two parts on the left-hand side of this equation. So here are several definitions. The first one, PF, that's the unit price of food. And F stands for F stands for the quantity of food. Here you see units per week, that's quantity of food, right? And the other part is price of clothing multiplied by quantity of clothing. So as you see, each part is actually the total expense in each department. The first one is the total expense in the food department, unitary price of food multiplied by quantity of food. And the second part is the total expense in clothing. Again, unitary price of clothing multiplied by quantity of clothing. And because we leave no money on the table, we totally deplete our income. That's why the addition of the left equal to the right-hand side. Then let's look at this practice question and try to figure out. I'm trying to use this numeric example to demonstrate to you why this format is aligned. Okay, let's look at this, and I'll give you 3 minutes to work on question 1 and 2 minutes to work on question 2. And since this is a video, I suggest you pause the video for 5 minutes, give you a little time to work on this first. And I'll proceed with my document on camera. I'll read this through. So here the story is that we have in total $80. And let me reiterate the equation, the general equation that we introduced and put it here. So price of food, PF is unit price of food. P C is unit price of clothing. Okay. And F is quantity of food. C is quantity of clothing. Okay. And here, what we introduced is the total expense in food is PF by F plus total expense in clothing, PC by C, that equals to the total income. Now, in this case, let's look at this example. Say the total income to distribute between food and clothing is $80. So I equals to 80. Unit price of food is 1, PF equal to 1, and unit price of clothing is 2, PC equal to 2. So the first question is to work out an equation that depicts the distribution of income. So you can directly plug in those numbers in, or we can use our intuition, which is what is the total expense in food? Well, that's 1 by how many food that you purchase, 1 by F, plus total expense in clothing, 2 by C, that should just equal to the budget. Again, we need to deplete that totally. Okay, so this one is then the format of the trade-off between clothing and food under the current condition, which is to deplete perfectly your budget. Then question 2 is to ask us to draw a curve or a line represent the budget constraint that this consumer is facing in the XY diagram. That's this, right? And we have an x-axis, we have an y-axis, where quantity of clothing is the vertical axis and quantity of food is the horizontal axis. We do have a vertical axis and we have a horizontal axis. Just label them by the side. So if you're acute with the linear format, you should eyeball this and know it is a linear case, linear function. Just in case you don't have that insight, okay, then let us use the format, use the notation that we are familiar with as the referencing point. So here, as illustrated, food is on the x-axis, so we can replace F with X, and this 1 multiplied by can be omitted for simplicity, plus 2 by C, and C is your Y, right? So 2Y equals to 80. And when it is written this way, probably some of you have already detected, oh, this is a linear format, because this is actually a standard form, AX plus BY equals to C, where A, the coefficient of X equal to 1, the coefficient of Y equal to 2, that's B, and C on the other side equals to 8. Again, just in case it's still a little bit unfamiliar to you, what you can do is to convert that into the format you are totally comfortable with, which is this. Y equals to A plus BX, the slope-intercept format. So for that, to get that, we need to leave Y alone on the left-hand side. So what we're going to do is move X to the other side and change the sign. So we have 2Y equals to 80 minus X. And then we divide 2 to both sides of the equation. We have Y equals to 40 minus a half of X. So this is actually the equation or the formula or the function form, right, of this coming from this budget constraint. And we know this is a line, that's why we call it budget constraint, also a budget line. So say later on, we're going to fit this back into clothing, food world. So it will be more straightforward if we convert those notation back into food versus clothes. So here, food, that's Y equals to, which is C replace Y, that equals to 40 minus half of X. X is your F. So this is the format between F and C, which is the exchange that we make between the quantity of food and clothing so that we can deplete our income just totally, perfectly. Okay, so let's draw the line. So here it is a slope intercept, and this 140 is the y slope, right? Y intercept. So let's put it here, 40, and so the x-intercept is when c equals to 0, we can solve it. When f equals to 80, c equals to 0, and then we can draw it as a line here. Right? So this line represents the original trade-off between the two. And then I would like to add several things. So the first one, let's go back to the slides. The first one is, what is the meaning of points in this diagram? Okay, let's start this discussion with looking into the meaning of A, B, C, D, E, those 5 points. Okay, what happens? What is something special with those bundles represented by those points? Well, each bundle, if you calculate that, will be just perfect depletion of the budget. So those bundles, those dots that are on the line, just on the fringe, right? That is just perfectly depletion of the money into purchasing those goods. So that's point 1. And point 2, the slope, okay, of this curve, right, which is minus half, that is exactly the price ratio, noting that PF equal to 1, PC equal to 2, right? The price ratio between the two. And it's negative because we cannot increase our purchase in both at the same time. In that way, we run out of our budget. Our budget won't be sufficient. So what we can do is we forgo 10 units of clothing from B to D for additional 20 units of food, right? So that's why it's a negative sign in between. Okay, that's the second thing. And the third thing is what happens for a dot that is lower than, if you can see where my cursor is, what happens for a dot that is lower than this line? That dot actually represents a bundle of product whose expenditure will be lower than the budget, meaning you leave some money on the table if you purchase at that point, at that bundle. What happens if it is a point that is much higher than this line? Well, then that will be, say, my dream of Maserati. I want it, I can't afford it, right? Then it indicates further the location. What's the meaning of location in this budget constraint world? Well, again, the high up, the farther away it is from the point of origin is associated with higher cost. And if you are able to afford it, that indicates stronger affordability, right? Okay. And we are going to be looking into the next example, which is stronger affordability. But before getting into that, let's look at another 2 convenient points, okay, which are so-called the endpoints. So let's look at the first point, the y-intercept. What is the y-intercept? Well, if we go to the slides actually rearranged this budget constraint into the slope-intercept format. And here, the y-intercept is I over PC. And let's look at what does point A mean. Well, point A is the point where, you purchase no food. Then point A is the point where we achieve the the highest possible amount of clothing permitted by the current budget, right? So the most clothing that you can purchase is 80 over 2, which is 40. For the same reason, the other endpoint, which is 80, okay, which is point C underneath, that actually indicates the highest amount of food that you can purchase. Because at point C, we spend no money at all on clothing. And it's just dedicating solely all your money into food, how much you can buy. So then these two endpoints are very convenient points, actually tells you the respective category of goods whose maximal amount that you can possibly purchase permitted by the current budget. Now let's look at the first change, which is change of income. Okay, what happens if income changes? Again, I suggest you pause the video, give yourself 5 minutes to work on the first example. If I equals to 160, work on the new equation and try to graph it. And I'll proceed here for the succinctness of the video. So let's get to this. So in this case, your income, everything else is unchanged. Your income changes to 160, right? The question is, how does that affect your equation? How does that affect your curve? Okay, let's look at this equation. The left-hand side is actually not affected because the prices are not changing. So we can copy down the left-hand side, still 1F plus 2C, and then the right-hand side increases to 160, right? So we are gonna rearrange this formula, this function into this format, where C is in the left-hand side, functioning as Y. So that is 2C equals to 160 minus F, C equals to 80 minus half of F. So let's look at the math, see what changes. The slope is still the same, right? Whereas this y-intercept doubles. So it's actually this way then. It's the same slope, but the y-intercept doubles. So this is what we call parallel shifting, right? It's still parallel, it's shift outwards, okay, with no change in the slope. So that's the first one, I increases, okay? So what happens to this? And let me put it here, when I increases, budget line shift out, shift outwards parallelly in a parallel fashion. Parallel shift outwards. Okay. Then let's examine with our intuition. So previously, as I introduced to you the location of the point to the line, right? I introduced this as the location indicates affordability. So here you get more income, then you're stronger with your affordability, right? And it's parallel shifting, meaning you're equally more stronger in your affordability in clothing and as in food, right? So the increase in your affordability in clothing and the increase in your affordability in food, they are proportionate. So, and we can examine with the endpoint knowledge, right? So 160 over the price of food. So the x-intercept when you spend all your money on food will be 160 units of food that you can purchase maximally. And the maximal amount of clothing that you can purchase is 160 only spent on clothing whose unitary price is 2. Then 80 units is how much you can purchase maximally, right? In the maximum. Okay, so again, parallel shifting outwards. Your income increases, you're equally more affordable in food and clothes. So that's the first change. And let's now move into the second change. And by the way, if it is decrease in income, then it's going to be parallel shifting inwards because you're less affordable due to restriction of budget, which is low, which, I mean, your budget is becoming lower, right? So now let's look at the second case where it is the price change. Okay, I suggest you pause this for another 5 minutes. Working on case one. Okay, if the unit price of food changes to $2. Okay, now let's look into the document camera. Everything else doesn't change. It is still the old case that we are comparing to. I equals to 80 and PC still equal to 2, right? So now, before thinking about intuition, let's look at the math. So how do we write the new equation? So here it is on the right-hand side, the 80 doesn't change. In the food department, it is still 2 by C as this total cost, total expense on food, and total expense on, total expense on clothing, that's still 2 by C, and then total expense on food, that is 2 by F. Okay, and we can further rearrange this. So it is 2C equals to 80 minus 2F, C equals to 40 minus F. Okay, so here originally it was minus 0.5. Now as the slope, now the slope changes into -1, meaning it's going to be steeper because the absolute value of the slope increases, right? But here, see this 40, that's still why your y-intercept, it doesn't change. So intuitively, mathematically, we will get this result, right? And we can examine, so the other endpoint should be 40. Right? That is that you have in total $80. Now the unitary price of food is $2. Then the highest amount of food you can purchase is 80 over 2, 40. Now we use our concept of endpoints to get this, right? And now let's examine that with our intuition. So why is this point C stays the same? We say it's a pivot point. This point is pivoting here. It's hinged in. It's not changing anywhere. Why is that? Well, let's look at the nature of this point, right? The nature of this point is we spend no money on food. We only spend money on clothing, how many clothing we can get. And let's look at the change. There is no changing in clothing. There is no change in income. The change is merely taking place in food. And here, this point doesn't change because by only spending money on clothing, we avoid the influence from food anyhow, right? That's why this point, the y-intercept or the clothing intercept is the pivot point. This point stays the same. Then here in this case, right, as price of food increases, sorry, it's too small. As price of food increases, right? Price of food increases, we change from the original inwards. So we say it is price of food increases, okay? The budget line rotate inwards. First, we verify this by looking at the endpoint of food, right? The maximal amount of food that you can purchase. That's one thing. But the other thing is we can verify this with our intuition of affordability. Now the food price increases, right? And then we become less affordable in food. That's why this line, in terms of food aspect, is shifting inwards closer to the point of the origin, indicating that your affordability in food decreases as the consequence of a price rise in food. Okay. And then let's look at the other case. If the food price decreases, still the pivot point will be the close intercept, but the food aspect, in terms of the food aspect, we are becoming more affordable, right? So that's why for the case that the food price decreases from $1 per each to $0.50 each, now the budget line is rotating outwards.